Some stories don't begin with wealth, comfort, or beauty. They begin in the shadows, where pain hides behind silent eyes. That was how Emily's story began, though she had no idea her broken path would one day lead her to a man whose life was filled with everything but love. Emily had once known the comfort of a home, the laughter of a mother's voice, and the warmth of freshly baked bread. But life has a cruel way of testing the weak. Her parents were lost to illness when she was still in her teens, and with no family to hold her, she drifted into the unforgiving streets of the city. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, until the idea of a home became nothing more than a faded dream. The streets were not kind. Every day was a battle for survival. Emily learned to sleep in abandoned corners, to shield herself with thin blankets left behind by strangers, and to find food from what others threw away. Yet, unlike many who gave in to despair, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She never begged aggressively. She never shouted or cursed at those who ignored her. Instead, she sat silently, as though waiting for life to notice her again. People walked past her as if she were invisible. To them, she was just another lost soul in a crowded world. But there was one man who, though he didn't stop at first, could never completely ignore her presence. His name was Alexander Reed, a man of immense wealth. He was the kind of figure whose name echoed through boardrooms and business magazines. His life appeared perfect: a mansion on the hills, fleets of luxury cars, and the kind of respect only money could command. But Alexander carried a hidden emptiness. Behind the walls of his success, he was lonely. Friends came for his influence. Women admired his fortune, but no one ever truly saw the man beneath the title. Every evening, Alexander's sleek car drove down the same avenue, where city lights reflected on wet pavements and people rushed home from their long days. And every evening, Emily sat at the same corner, her thin frame wrapped in a scarf too old to keep out the cold, her eyes staring not at the passers-by, but at some distant horizon only she could see. At first, Alexander tried to dismiss the strange pull he felt whenever his gaze landed on her. She was just a homeless girl, after all, someone the world had already written off. But as days passed, he realized there was something in her silence that spoke louder than words. She didn't ask, she didn't complain, she simply endured. And that quiet endurance unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. One particularly cold evening, rain soaked the streets. Alexander slowed his car when he noticed her again, sitting in the downpour with only her thin blanket to shield her. Something inside him stirred, a voice he hadn't heard in years, the voice of compassion. Without overthinking, he stopped his car a few feet away and stepped out, his expensive coat already heavy with rain. He walked to her silently and placed a hot cup of coffee and a small box of food beside her. He didn't speak, and neither did she. She only lifted her eyes for a brief moment, eyes that carried both gratitude and sorrow. Alexander walked back to his car without looking back, but that image stayed with him. That night, as he lay in his grand, empty mansion, he thought not of his empire or tomorrow's meetings, but of the girl in the rain who hadn't spoken a word, yet somehow had filled the silence of his heart. He told himself it was a one-time act of kindness. Yet the next evening, he found himself pulling over again, this time with a blanket. The evening after that, with fresh bread. And so it began, not a relationship of words, but of quiet gestures. He never asked her name, and she never asked why he came. But slowly, without realizing it, Alexander had started to look forward to those brief encounters more than anything else in his day. For the first time in years, the man who had everything began to feel the stirrings of something money could not buy: connection. Emily didn't know it yet, but her presence had already begun to touch the heart of a man the world believed untouchable. Every heart has a door, and sometimes it is the quietest souls who hold the key. Alexander never intended to open his heart to a stranger on the street, yet with every silent meeting, Emily was slowly turning the lock he didn't even know existed. It became a ritual, something Alexander could no longer resist. His car would glide down the avenue each evening, and his eyes would instinctively search for her. There she would be, in her usual spot, her frame fragile but her presence strangely steady, as though she had claimed that little corner of the world as her own. Alexander's life, once defined by strict schedules and relentless ambition, began to shift. Meetings felt longer, dinners felt emptier, and his home felt colder. Yet in those fleeting moments when he placed food or clothing beside Emily, he felt a warmth he couldn't explain. He had known plenty of women, charming, beautiful, sophisticated, but none of them had stirred his heart with the quiet force that this nameless girl in rags did. At first, Alexander convinced himself that it was pity, that his gestures were nothing more than acts of charity. But deep down, he knew pity wasn't what drew him back every evening. It was the way she looked at him, not with admiration for his wealth, not with greed or desperation, but with a kind of acknowledgement, as if she saw the man beneath the suit. Emily, on the other hand, was cautious. Life had taught her not to trust kindness easily. Too many promises had been broken, too many helping hands had disappeared when she needed them most. But this man, this stranger who never asked her name, never demanded anything in return, confused her. He didn't treat her like a burden, nor did he look at her with disgust like most passers-by. His silence felt safe, and though she didn't show it, her heart began to soften with each visit. One evening, Alexander left not only food but also a small notebook and pen. It was a simple gift, yet it meant more to Emily than he could ever imagine. For years, her thoughts had lived only inside her mind, bottled up with nowhere to go. That night, by the dim light of a street lamp, she opened the notebook and began to write. Her handwriting was shaky, her words unpolished, but her soul poured onto those pages. She wrote about her parents, about the cruel twist of fate that had left her alone, about the nights she went hungry and the mornings she woke up shivering. But she also wrote about hope, the hope that maybe, just maybe, life still had something left for her. When Alexander saw her scribbling in the notebook the next day, something inside him shifted. For the first time, he wondered about her story, about who she truly was. Yet he didn't ask. He didn't want to break the fragile trust they had built through silence. Instead, he continued his quiet companionship, letting time weave its own threads between them. Meanwhile, whispers about Alexander began to grow. His staff noticed the subtle changes in him, the way he smiled more often, the way his stern demeanor softened. They didn't know the reason, but they sensed something had shifted in their powerful employer. Alexander himself couldn't deny it. He began canceling late-night meetings, finding excuses to leave his office earlier. Business partners wondered why, but Alexander only knew one truth. Success had finally taken a back seat to something that made him feel alive. Then, one evening, the unexpected happened. As Alexander approached her corner, he noticed she wasn't there. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar panic. For the first time, he realized how deeply he had come to rely on her presence. He searched the street, scanning every shadow, but she was nowhere to be found. Fear, sharp and unexplainable, surged through him. What if something had happened to her? What if the world had taken away the one thing that had begun to give his life meaning? An hour later, he found her a few streets away, sitting near a church wall, her face pale, her body trembling. She had fallen ill, too weak to return to her usual spot. Alexander's heart clenched. For years, he had lived in comfort without feeling much. But in that moment, seeing her fragile and vulnerable, he felt pain, real pain, for the first time in years. That night, he didn't simply leave food beside her. He knelt down, placed his coat over her shoulders, and for the first time, whispered a silent promise to himself. He would not let her suffer like this again. Unknowingly, Alexander had crossed the line between pity and love. Sometimes love begins not with grand gestures, but with a single moment of weakness. For Alexander, seeing Emily shivering on the cold pavement was the moment his heart made a choice his mind could no longer deny. From that night onward, Alexander could no longer stand at a distance. What began as quiet offerings of food and clothing turned into genuine concern. He returned the next day with medicine, soup, and a heavier blanket. This time, instead of simply placing them beside her, he stayed a while, watching to ensure she ate. Emily was hesitant. Suspicion clouded her tired eyes. Yet hunger overpowered pride, and she accepted. Something shifted in their silent exchange. For years, Alexander had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him. His influence, his signature, his wealth. But Emily asked for nothing. Even in her weakest state, she carried herself with a quiet strength that humbled him. In the following weeks, he began visiting more often. He didn't announce himself or demand acknowledgement. He simply appeared, ensuring she had food, warm clothes, and medicine. And though Emily said little, her heart began to thaw. The streets had taught her not to trust kindness, but this man was different. He came back, again and again, without expectations. Slowly, her defenses began to crumble. One evening, as Alexander brought her a basket of fresh fruit, Emily finally spoke, not with words, but through the notebook he had given her. She handed it to him, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were pages filled with her story, her childhood memories, the illness that claimed her parents, the loneliness of losing everything, and her struggle to survive. The words were raw, unpolished, but they carried the weight of truth. Alexander read in silence, his heart tightening with each sentence. By the time he closed the notebook, he saw her not as the homeless girl on the street, but as Emily, a soul carved by pain, yet still clinging to hope. He didn't tell her, but in that moment, his respect for her grew deeper than he had ever felt for anyone. The world around them, however, was not blind. Passers-by began to notice the wealthy businessman who often stopped at the corner for the ragged girl. Whispers started to spread, curiosity, judgment, gossip. Some thought he was merely indulging in charity. Others speculated something more. For Alexander, none of it mattered. But for Emily, the whispers cut deep. She had lived her life unseen, and now, suddenly, eyes followed her every move. It terrified her. One evening, she wasn't at her usual spot again. Alexander searched until he found her sitting by the riverbank, her notebook beside her, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. When he approached, she didn't turn to him. Instead, she whispered the first words she had ever spoken to him. "Why me?" The simplicity of the question struck him harder than anything else. Why her, indeed? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that in a world full of polished smiles and empty conversations, she was real. And that reality was what his heart craved. From then on, Alexander made a decision he never thought he would make. He began to shield her, not just from hunger or illness, but from the harsh judgment of the world. He arranged for her to stay temporarily in a safe shelter run by a local church. It wasn't much, just a small bed and meals, but it was more than she had known in years. Emily resisted at first, fearing dependence, but Alexander reassured her gently, never forcing, only offering. As days turned into weeks, Emily regained some strength. She began to smile, small, hesitant smiles that lit up her weary face. And Alexander found himself drawn deeper into her orbit. He visited the shelter often, bringing books, flowers, and small gifts that reminded her she was not forgotten. Each time he saw her smile, he felt something inside him heal. Yet, as their bond deepened, so did the risks. The business world Alexander belonged to thrived on image. A powerful man seen with a homeless girl could spark scandal, ridicule, even ruin. And indeed, murmurs reached the ears of his associates. At first subtle, then sharper, they questioned his choices. Some even warned him that his reputation could suffer. But Alexander didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't living for appearances. He was living for something real. Still, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. Emily carried wounds deeper than the world could see, and his life was a world she had never belonged to. Yet as he looked at her, fragile but fierce, he silently vowed he would walk this road, no matter the obstacles. For love, once awakened, refuses to return to silence. Every love story is tested, not by the moments of joy, but by the storms that threaten to tear it apart. For Alexander and Emily, the storm was closer than either of them realized. Emily had begun to heal, slowly but surely. The safe shelter gave her a roof, food, and time to breathe. For the first time in years, she could sleep without fearing the cold pavement or the cruelty of strangers. But even as her body regained strength, her heart remained guarded. Life had taught her not to believe in permanence. Kindness always seemed to vanish just when she learned to depend on it. Yet Alexander kept returning. His visits were never loud or demanding. He would bring her books, encouraging her to read and write. He would share small pieces of his own life, not grand stories of wealth, but simple truths, like how lonely his mansion felt despite its luxury, or how he sometimes envied ordinary people who had real families. These confessions surprised Emily. To her, he seemed untouchable, a man who had everything. But as she listened, she realized that wealth could not shield someone from emptiness. In his own way, Alexander was as homeless as she was. With each passing week, Emily's trust deepened. She began writing more in the notebook, poems, reflections, and even dreams for the future. She would timidly hand it to Alexander, who read every word with reverence. For him, her words were treasures, more valuable than any deal he had ever signed. But the world outside their fragile bond was not so kind. Rumors began to swirl in the business community. Alexander's rivals, always eager to see him falter, whispered about the mystery girl who had captured his time and attention. Associates warned him that his reputation was at risk. Investors questioned his judgment. Some mocked him behind closed doors, saying he had lost his mind over a beggar. Alexander ignored them, but the pressure grew heavier each day. For the first time, his empire felt fragile, not because of money, but because of perception. His name had been built on power and control, and now people saw weakness in his devotion to a girl with nothing. Emily sensed the whispers too. Even in the shelter, people spoke. Some were kind, believing her story was one of hope, but others judged harshly, suggesting she was only clinging to Alexander for his wealth. These words pierced her deeply. She had never asked him for anything, yet the world painted her as someone taking advantage of his kindness. One evening, she confronted her fears in the only way she knew, through her writing. She poured out her thoughts in the notebook, confessing her gratitude but also her terror. She feared being a burden, feared that one day he would regret ever knowing her. When Alexander read those words, his heart broke. He realized that the greatest battle they faced was not against gossip or business rivals, but against Emily's own belief that she was unworthy of love. Determined to prove her wrong, Alexander took a bold step. He invited her to his home, not as charity, but as an equal guest. Emily resisted at first, trembling at the thought of stepping into his world. But Alexander's patience convinced her. And so, one evening, she found herself standing before the grand mansion that glittered against the night sky. Walking through the doors felt surreal. The marble floors, the chandeliers, the vastness of the place. It was a world so far from the streets she had known. Emily felt small, out of place, almost ashamed of her worn clothes and fragile frame. But Alexander looked at her as though she belonged there more than anyone else. He showed her the library, the gardens, the rooms filled with silence. And for the first time, Emily understood. All this wealth had meant nothing to him until she walked through those doors. Yet happiness, fragile as glass, rarely comes without cracks. News of Emily's visit spread quickly. Paparazzi caught glimpses, and soon her image, thin, weary, wrapped in old clothes, circulated in newspapers and online. The world laughed at the powerful billionaire who brought a homeless girl into his mansion. Headlines mocked their bond. Critics questioned his sanity. Emily saw the articles and felt her chest tighten with shame. The cruel laughter of strangers was louder than Alexander's reassurances. That night, she cried quietly, torn between the warmth of love she had found and the icy judgment of a world that refused to see her heart. Alexander, however, remained steadfast. Holding her trembling hands, he whispered through his actions what words could not express, that he would stand against the world if it meant keeping her by his side. But deep down, both knew, the real test was only beginning. True love is never tested in moments of comfort. It is tested when the world tries to tear it apart. For Emily and Alexander, the storm of judgment grew louder each day, and Emily's fragile heart began to question whether love was worth the cost. The scandal spread like wildfire. Newspapers mocked Alexander, portraying him as a fool blinded by pity. Online tabloids painted Emily as a gold digger, a schemer who had trapped a billionaire's heart with tears and rags. Business partners grew uneasy, investors pulled back, and whispers of betrayal echoed in boardrooms. For a man like Alexander, reputation was everything, and it was slipping through his fingers. Emily read every headline in silence, each word cutting deeper than the last. She had never asked for this attention. All she had ever wanted was a little warmth in a cold world. Yet suddenly, she was being painted as a villain. One night, as she sat in Alexander's library with the notebook on her lap, she wrote the words she could never bring herself to say aloud. "I should leave before I ruin him completely." Alexander found the note hours later. Panic surged through him as he rushed to find her. She was sitting alone in the garden, her eyes swollen from crying. When he asked her why, she didn't answer. But her silence was louder than words. She believed that walking away was the only way to protect him. For Alexander, this was the moment of truth. He had built an empire with iron determination, but this woman, this fragile girl who had nothing, had given him something greater than all his wealth combined. And now, she wanted to leave because the world couldn't understand. He couldn't allow it. He knelt before her, not as a billionaire, but as a man stripped of pride, and he told her through his steady gaze that his choice had already been made. If he had to lose the approval of the world to keep her, then so be it. For once, Alexander wasn't fighting for contracts or companies. He was fighting for love. Still, the pressure mounted. Rivals spread rumors that his company was unstable. Board members questioned his leadership. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his scandal. Alexander stood tall through it all, but Emily saw the toll it was taking. She hated herself for being the cause of his suffering. Each night, she lay awake in the grand mansion, torn between the love that filled her heart and the guilt that weighed it down. Then came the breaking point. An important deal Alexander had been negotiating for months collapsed overnight. Investors blamed his poor judgment, citing the controversy surrounding his personal life. The loss cost millions, but what hurt him more was seeing the gleam of victory in his rivals' eyes. They had been waiting for him to stumble, and now they celebrated his fall. Emily couldn't bear it. She decided that leaving was no longer a choice but a necessity. In the quiet hours of the morning, she packed the few belongings she had and slipped away from the mansion. Her note this time was brief. "You gave me more than I ever dreamed of, but your world is not mine. I will not let you fall because of me." When Alexander discovered she was gone, he felt a hollow ache that no wealth could fill. For days, he searched the city, combing through shelters, churches, and streets. But she seemed to have vanished into the same shadows she had once lived in. The mansion felt emptier than ever. His empire, though shaken, still stood, but it meant nothing without her. He realized then that the world could take his reputation, his fortune, even his pride, but he could not let it take Emily. Not when she had given him the one thing he had never known before, love that was real. Driven by desperation, he made a choice that stunned everyone. He stepped away from his empire, handing over the reins of his company temporarily. His wealth had built his kingdom, but his heart told him it was time to search for his queen. And so, Alexander left behind the world of boardrooms and headlines and began his search for Emily, not as a billionaire chasing a possession, but as a man searching for the missing half of his soul. The city was wide, the streets endless, and the shadows deep. But he knew one thing for certain. He would not rest until he found her. Sometimes love must be lost before it is truly found. For Alexander, the emptiness left by Emily's absence became the proof of how much she meant to him. And nothing, not even the weight of the world, could keep him from finding her again. The days stretched into weeks as Alexander searched for Emily. His suits grew wrinkled, his beard unshaven, his once polished appearance replaced by the weary determination of a man with only one mission: to bring her back. He searched every corner of the city, abandoned parks, crowded shelters, even the riverbanks where she once sat with her notebook. But Emily remained hidden, a ghost in the city she had once quietly endured. Meanwhile, Emily tried to return to the shadows she had known. She thought distance would protect Alexander, thought her disappearance would free him from judgment. But the heart cannot be silenced so easily. Each night, she found herself writing in her notebook, and every word carried his name. She missed his steady presence, the warmth of his gestures, the way he saw her not as a burden, but as a soul worth cherishing. Yet guilt chained her heart, convincing her she had done the right thing by leaving. Then, one evening, fate intervened. A charity event was being held by the same church shelter that had once housed Emily. Alexander, desperate for a clue, attended in disguise, hoping someone had seen her. As speeches echoed and lights glittered, he stood at the edge of the crowd until his eyes froze. There, among the volunteers serving food, was Emily. Her clothes were simple, her hair tied back, but her presence radiated a quiet beauty he had never seen before. Time seemed to stop. For a moment, neither moved. Emily's eyes widened as she saw him across the hall, and her heart pounded with a mix of fear and longing. She wanted to run, but her legs refused. In that instant, she realized something. She had tried to protect him by leaving, but all she had done was break them both. Alexander crossed the hall in determined strides. When he reached her, there were no words, no explanations, only silence heavy with everything they had endured. His gaze told her what she had doubted, that he had not lost anything by loving her, but had gained everything. Emily's tears fell freely as she realized the truth she had run from. He didn't care about the world's laughter. He didn't care about lost deals or broken reputations. All he cared about was her. From that night, Emily no longer resisted. Alexander brought her back into his world, but this time not in secrecy or shame. He introduced her openly, standing tall against the whispers. At first, society mocked, but slowly, as people saw her strength, her dignity, and the undeniable transformation in Alexander himself, their laughter faded. What began as scandal grew into respect, a story of love that could not be crushed by wealth, pride, or the cruelty of judgment. Emily, once homeless and forgotten, found herself no longer surviving but living. The mansion that once echoed with emptiness now rang with warmth. The notebook that once carried only sorrow now bloomed with poetry of hope. And Alexander, once a man defined by riches, was finally rich in the truest sense, because he had found love that money could never buy. Their journey had been tested by storms, but in the end, it was the very storms that proved the strength of their love. And so, the homeless girl won not just a rich man's heart, but his soul, his life, and a forever home in the place she never thought she'd belong, his heart.